Elias didn't look up from his sharpening stone when the three riders pulled into the yard, but he knew exactly which one had the notched ear. The sound of the horses was enough to tell him the story. One was heavy and tired. One was young and skittish. But the horse in the lead stepped with a rhythmic precision that Elias hadn't heard in 7 years. It was the sound of a predator that never grew weary. He kept his head down. His thumb traced the edge of the skinning knife. The metal was cold despite the midday sun beating down on the porch. Each pass of the blade against the stone made a thin, dry hiss. It was the only sound in the valley until the lead horse stopped just short of the porch steps. The man in the center of the trio didn't dismount. He sat there in a coat covered in the gray dust of the high plains. He leaned forward and adjusted his hat, and that was when the sun caught the side of his head. A jagged triangular piece was missing from his right ear. It looked like a mark left by a dull blade or a very hungry dog. On his left, a younger man kept shifting in his saddle. This boy couldn't have been more than 20. He had a nervous habit of pulling at his own collar and then wiping his sweaty palms on his leather chaps. His horse mirrored his anxiety and kept sidestepping and tossing its head. On the right was a mountain of a man who sat perfectly still. He didn't have a rifle in his scabbard. Instead, he had a thick iron chain wrapped around his forearm like a combat medic might wrap a bandage. He just watched Elias with eyes that looked like 2 holes burnt into a sheet of parchment. The man with the notched ear cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You've grown a beard, Elias," he said. "It makes you look like a man who never burned a church full of people in Abilene." Elias stopped the sharpening stone mid-stroke. The silence that followed was heavy. It felt like the air before a lightning strike. He didn't look up to deny it. He didn't look up to explain. He just looked at the oil on his stone and felt the weight of a decade of secrets pushing against his ribs. The mention of Abilene was a hook meant to rip the skin off his new life. It was a signal to the 2 men flanking the porch that the man sitting there wasn't just a farmer. The nervous kid on the left reached for his canteen, but his hands shook so hard the metal cap clattered against his teeth. The big man with the chain didn't blink. He just tightened his grip until the iron links groaned against each other. Elias finally looked up. His eyes didn't go to the leader. They went to the kid. "You should head back to whatever town you came from, son," Elias said. His voice was low and carried the rasp of a man who didn't use it often. "This isn't the kind of company that lets you grow old." The kid looked at the leader and then back at Elias. He didn't leave. He just wiped his palms again and gripped his reins until his knuckles turned white. The man with the notched ear laughed. "His name is Silas now. He was a captain of industry in his own mind, but a butcher by trade. We aren't here for the boy, Elias. We are here for the ledger. The one you walked away with when the smoke was still rising over the plains. The company has a long memory and even longer reach." Elias stood up slowly. He didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the house. He just stood his full height and let the shadows of the porch fall across his face. "I don't have any ledgers, Silas. I don't have anything but this dirt and the piece I bought with the blood I spilled." Silas leaned over the pommel of his saddle. He was close enough now that Elias could smell the stale tobacco and the sour sweat of a long ride. "Peace is an expensive commodity, Elias. And you haven't finished paying the bill." He looked toward the cabin door. "Is she inside? The little girl with the eyes that looked just like yours?" Elias felt a coldness settle in his marrow that had nothing to do with the wind. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to thicken. "If you step off that horse, Silas, you won't live long enough to see the inside of that house." The big man with the chain started to unwrap the iron from his arm. The clink of the metal was loud in the yard. Silas raised a hand to stop him. "Not yet," he whispered. He pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest and clicked it open. "We will be back at sunrise, Elias. You can have the ledger ready, or you can have the girl ready. But if I have to come up those steps myself, I am going to make sure everyone in this territory knows exactly what you did to those families in Abilene." Silas turned his horse, and the other 2 followed. They rode out of the yard without looking back and left a cloud of choking dust hanging in the air. Elias stayed on the porch until the sound of the hooves died away completely. He looked down at the sharpening stone in his left hand. He hadn't realized he was squeezing it. A hairline fracture had opened up right down the center of the rock. With a small brittle snap, the stone broke in 2. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking, but they were stained with the gray dust of the riders. He walked down the steps into the yard to clear his head, but stopped when he saw something glinting in the dirt where the nervous kid had been sitting. He reached down and picked up a small silver locket. He pried it open with a dirty fingernail. Inside was a portrait of a woman, but it wasn't a stranger. It was a face he recognized from a life he thought he had buried in the ash. The riders weren't just looking for him. They were looking for her. And they had no idea she was already closer than they realized. Elias closed the locket and felt the sharp edges bite into his palm. The farmer was gone. The monster was waking up. The silver locket felt like a hot coal in the center of Elias's palm. He stood in the middle of the yard while the dust settled back into the dry ruts of the trail. The silence of the mountain was usually a comfort, but now it felt like a heavy blanket pressing against his lungs. He looked at the trail where the 3 riders had disappeared, and then he looked back at the small silver oval in his hand. He pried the hinge open again. The face inside was delicate with eyes that seemed to hold a secret that had haunted him across 3 states and a decade of silence. It was Sarah. He hadn't said her name out loud in 7 years. To say it was to admit she had existed. To say it was to admit that the fire in Abilene hadn't just taken the church and the ledger, but it had taken the only light he had ever known. Seeing her face in a locket dropped by a nervous boy working for Silas changed everything. It meant the hunt wasn't just about a book of names and numbers. It was about blood. He walked back toward the porch, his boots heavy on the dirt. He didn't go inside immediately. He stood by the sharpening stone that now lay in 2 jagged pieces on the floorboards. He picked up the halves and looked at the fracture. A clean break, just like his life. He tossed the broken stone into the tall grass and picked up the Winchester. The wood of the stock was scarred, but the action was smooth as silk when he cycled the lever. 1 round in the chamber, 5 in the tube. It wasn't enough. Not for what was coming at sunrise. He finally pushed the door open. The cabin was cool and dim. In the corner by the hearth, the girl was sitting on a low wooden stool. Her name was Clara. She was 7 years old, and she had been drawing in the soot on the stones of the fireplace. She didn't look up when he entered. She was used to his long silences and his heavy moods. But she felt the change in the air. Children in the frontier grew a 6th sense for trouble long before they learned to read. Elias put the rifle on the table and sat down across from her. He placed the locket on the scarred pine wood between them. Clara looked at the silver object and her eyes widened. "Is that a gift?" she asked. Her voice was small and clear like a bell in a high valley. Elias didn't answer right away. He watched her small fingers reach out to touch the silver. He saw the way her eyes mirrored the woman in the portrait. The same curve of the brow, the same set of the jaw. If Silas or the big man with the chain got a look at her, they wouldn't need a ledger to know who he was. They would see the ghost of Abilene written in her face. "I found it in the yard," Elias said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to make the shadows in the corner stir. "I need you to listen to me, Clara. Do you remember the game we played when the wolves came into the lower pasture last winter?" The girl nodded. "The quiet game," she whispered. "I go into the crawl space under the floorboards, and I don't make a sound until you knock 3 times on the wood." Elias reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was light. "We are going to play that game tonight. But this time it isn't for wolves. It's for men. Men who have forgotten what happens when they cross a line they can't uncross." He stood up and began to move through the cabin with a focused intensity. He wasn't the farmer anymore. He was the man Silas remembered. He pulled a loose floorboard near the back wall and revealed a shallow hole lined with oiled canvas. He pulled out a heavy gun belt and a pair of revolvers that hadn't seen the sun in years. The leather was stiff and smelled of old grease. He didn't strap them on. Instead, he sat back down at the table and began to take them apart piece by piece. As he cleaned the cylinders, he thought about the boy who had dropped the locket. The kid was young and scared. He wasn't a killer yet, but he was traveling with Silas and the man with the chain. That meant he was a witness. And in the world Elias came from, witnesses were more dangerous than gunmen. He wondered how the boy got the locket. Did he steal it from Sarah before the fire? Or did he find it in the ruins? The thought of those nervous hands touching Sarah's things made a dark heat rise in Elias's chest. He looked at the locket again. If Silas knew about the girl, he wouldn't have waited until sunrise. He would have burnt the house down with them inside. That meant they were still guessing. They were testing him to see if the wolf still had teeth. He looked at Clara, who was now watching him clean the pistols. "Why did the man say you burn a church?" she asked. Elias froze. His hand stopped mid-motion on the trigger guard. He realized she had been listening through the thin walls of the cabin. He looked at her, and for a moment he saw the fire in Abilene reflected in his own memory. The screaming. The heat that turned the night into noon. The way the ledger felt in his hand as he ran through the back door while the world turned to ash behind him. Some men tell stories to make themselves feel powerful, Clara, he said. And some stories are just shadows that follow you because you don't have the heart to kill them. He put the pistol back together with a sharp metallic snap. But shadows can't hurt you if you stay in the light. He spent the next hour fortifying the cabin. He moved the heavy oak dresser in front of the window. He checked the seal on the back door. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He just moved. Every few minutes his hand would go to his pocket to feel the locket. It was a weight and a weapon all at once. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, the valley turned a deep, bruised purple. Elias walked out onto the porch one last time. He didn't bring the rifle. He just brought a shovel. He went to the spot where the riders had sat and began to dig. He didn't dig deep, just enough to bury the locket in the dirt where they had stood. He wanted it there. He wanted them to be standing right on top of the ghost of the woman they had destroyed when the leads started flying. He stood up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The air was turning cold. He looked at the tree line where he knew Silas was watching from a camp in the dark. He could almost feel the eyes of the big man with the chain. "You should have stayed in the plains," Silas Elias whispered into the wind. "This mountain doesn't forgive, and it never forgets." He went back inside and dropped the heavy bar across the door. He sat in the dark with the Winchester across his lap and waited for the world to turn gray. He wasn't waiting for the morning. He was waiting for the end. The cabin felt smaller in the dark. Elias sat at the heavy pine table with a single candle burning between him and the girl. The flame flickered in the draft that whistled through the chinking of the logs, and it cast long dancing shadows against the walls. To a stranger, it looked like a peaceful home. To Elias, it felt like a cage. He watched Clara sleep on the small rope bed in the corner. Her breathing was steady, but her hands were curled into tight fists even in her dreams. She knew the game had changed. She knew the wolves tonight had names and faces. Elias reached into the pocket of his wool vest and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This was the ledger Silas had traveled 300 miles to find. It wasn't filled with gold or maps to a hidden vein. It was filled with ink. Names of judges who took bribes. Names of marshals who looked the other way while the company cleared out homesteads. It was a record of every sin committed in the name of progress across the territory. And at the very end, on a page stained with a dark copper-colored blot, was the entry for Abilene. He ran his thumb over the leather. Silas called it a debt, but Elias knew it was a death warrant. As long as this book existed, the men who ran the company could never sleep. And as long as Elias held it, he was the most dangerous man in the mountains. He looked at the candle flame and remembered the heat of that night 7 years ago. He remembered the way the church doors had been chained from the outside. He remembered the smell of coal oil and the sound of Sarah's voice screaming his name from inside the sanctuary. He hadn't started the fire, but he hadn't stopped it either. He had been standing by the horses with the ledger in his hand and orders to ride. By the time he realized Silas had moved from intimidation to mass murder, the roof was already sagging. He had chosen the book over the woman. He had chosen the evidence over the person. That was the scar on his reputation that no amount of mountain air could ever clean. He had spent 7 years trying to be a farmer to outrun the ghost of the man who stood by and watched a church burn. A floorboard creaked near the window. Elias didn't jump. He didn't even reach for the rifle. He just watched the shadows. A mouse scurried across the hearth and disappeared into a crack. The tension was a physical weight now. It was a cord pulled so tight it was humming. He stood up and walked to the hearth. He moved with a silent grace that didn't belong to a farmer. He knelt down and began to pry a stone loose from the very back of the chimney. Behind it was a hollow space filled with dry straw. He placed the ledger inside and replaced the stone. He didn't want the book near him when the sun came up. He wanted it where it belonged, hidden in the soot and the ash. He went to the window and moved a corner of the heavy curtain. The moon was a sliver of white bone hanging over the ridge. Out in the tree line, he saw a tiny orange spark. A campfire. Silas was out there sitting in the cold, probably drinking coffee and talking about the old days. He wondered if the nervous kid was awake. He wondered if the boy was looking for his locket. The image of Sarah in that silver frame kept flashing in his mind. It was a taunt. Silas was telling him that he knew everything. He was telling him that Abilene wasn't over. He was telling him that Sarah's death was a currency he intended to spend. Elias turned away from the window and picked up his gun belt. He began to strap it on. The leather creaked as he pulled it tight around his waist. The weight of the two revolvers felt right. It felt like a part of his body that had been missing for a long time. He drew the right-hand pistol and checked the cylinder one last time. He left the hammer resting on an empty chamber. Old habits were the only things that stayed true in a world gone sideways. He looked at Clara. He needed to move her now. The sunrise was only a few hours away, and Silas was a man of his word when it came to violence. He walked to the bed and placed a hand on her shoulder. Clara woke instantly. Her eyes were wide and dark. "Is it time?" she whispered. Elias nodded. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break the silence of the cabin with the sound of his own lies. He picked her up and carried her to the back of the room. He lifted the floorboard and showed her the crawl space. It was lined with blankets and had a small jug of water and a loaf of bread. "You stay here until the birds stop singing," Clara, Elias said. "Do you understand me? Even if you hear loud noises, even if you hear people calling your name, you stay in the dark until you hear my knock. 3 times. Fast. Like a woodpecker." The girl crawled into the hole without a word. She looked up at him one last time before he lowered the board. "You're going to be the monster now, aren't you?" she said. Elias felt a sharp pain in his chest that had nothing to do with a bullet. "I'm going to be whatever I have to be to make sure you get to grow up," he said. He lowered the wood and slid the heavy rug back over the top. He stood up and felt the silence return. But it was different now. It was a waiting silence. He walked back to the porch and sat in his chair. He didn't pick up the sharpening stone. He didn't pick up the knife. He just sat with the Winchester across his lap and watched the east. The first hint of gray began to bleed into the sky. It wasn't a beautiful sunrise. It was a cold, filtered light that made the world look like a charcoal drawing. Down in the yard, the dirt was still disturbed where he had buried the locket. Elias gripped the rifle. His knuckles were white. He could hear the horses now. They weren't galloping. They were walking slow. The rhythmic thud of the lead horse was back. He stood up and stepped into the center of the porch. He didn't hide behind the timber. He didn't seek cover. He stood in the open light where everyone could see him. He wanted Silas to see his face. He wanted the big man with the chain to see his hands. The 3 riders emerged from the trees like ghosts rising from the earth. They didn't stop at the gate this time. They rode right into the center of the yard. Silas was in the lead, and he was holding something in his hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a torch. The sun finally broke over the ridge, and the light hit the yard. Silas stopped his horse directly over the spot where the locket was buried. He looked at Elias and smiled. "Time's up, Elias," he called out. His voice was loud and jagged in the morning air. "I hope you found your memory during the night, because I brought a little bit of Abilene with me to help light the way." He held the torch high. The nervous kid looked like he was about to vomit. The big man with the chain began to whistle a low, tuneless melody. Elias didn't say a word. He just leveled the Winchester and took aim at the center of Silas's chest. The monster was awake, and it was hungry. The morning air was so cold it felt like breathing in broken glass. Elias didn't blink as he stared down the barrel of the Winchester. The front sight was a black notch carved against the greasy sheepskin of Silas's coat. He could see the torch flickering in Silas's hand. The flames were pale and sickly against the rising sun, but they carried a threat that went back 7 years. A torch was how the company finished their business. It was how they turned families into refugees and evidence into smoke. Silas sat his horse with a casual arrogance that only comes from a man who thinks he holds all the cards. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He just held that torch high like a twisted parody of a lighthouse. He looked down at the dirt beneath his horse's hooves. He was sitting exactly where Elias had buried the locket. He was sitting on top of the only piece of Sarah that Elias had left. The nervous kid on the left was falling apart. His horse was picking up on the static in the air, and it wouldn't stop shying away from the porch. The boy's face was a mask of gray terror. He looked like he wanted to turn and run, but he was more afraid of Silas than he was of the man on the porch. He kept glancing at the big man on the right, the one with the chain. The big man didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He had the iron chain wrapped loose around his fist now. He wasn't whistling anymore. He was just waiting for the order to become the nightmare he was born to be. "You're making a mistake, Elias," Silas called out. His voice was calm, but it had an edge like a rusted saw. "I don't want the girl. I don't even want you. I just want what belongs to the company. Give me the book and we ride out. You can go back to being a ghost, and I can go back to being a rich man." Elias didn't lower the rifle. He didn't even shift his weight. "You don't want the ledger, Silas. You want the truth to stay buried. But some things don't stay under the dirt. Not even when you burn the ground on top of them. Silas's smile faded. The mask of the businessman slipped, and the butcher underneath peered out. You always were too smart for your own good. That's why you survived Abilene. But your luck just ran out. Silas flicked his wrist, and the torch sailed through the air. It wasn't aimed at Elias. It was aimed at the dry hay in the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. In that split second, time slowed down to the beat of a single heart. Elias didn't shoot Silas. He shifted the barrel 2 inches to the left and pulled the trigger. The Winchester barked, and the bullet caught the torch midair. The wood shattered into 1,000 orange sparks that rained down harmlessly into the damp dirt of the yard. The sound of the shot was like a thunderclap in the small valley. The kid's horse reared up with a high, shrill scream. The boy lost his stirrups and tumbled backward into the dirt. Elias cycled the lever. The brass casing flew out in a golden arc and hit the porch floorboards with a sharp metallic tinkle. He didn't wait for Silas to react. He swung the barrel back to the center. The big man with the chain moved faster than a man of his size had any right to. He wasn't going for a gun. He leaned out of his saddle and swung the heavy iron links. The chain caught the edge of the porch railing and shattered the timber into splinters. If Elias hadn't stepped back, the iron would have taken his legs out. Silas finally drew his revolver. It was a beautiful piece with ivory grips, but the man holding it was ugly to the core. He fired twice. One bullet thudded into the log wall a foot from Elias's head. The other whistled past his ear and smashed the window behind him. Elias dropped to one knee. He didn't panic. He had been in the fire before. He knew that in a gunfight, the man who moves the fastest usually dies first, while the man who moves the smoothest lives to tell the story. He aimed at the big man's horse. He hated to do it, but the giant was the biggest threat. He fired again. The horse buckled, and the big man went down in a heap of leather and iron. Now the yard was a chaos of dust and gunpowder smoke. The kid was scrambled on the ground, trying to find his revolver in the dirt. Silas was trying to control his horse, which was spooked by the smell of blood and the sound of the lead. Elias felt a stinging heat on his cheek. A splinter from the wall had grazed him, but he didn't feel the pain. He just felt the cold clarity of the hunt. He saw the kid find his gun. The boy's eyes were wide, and he was pointing the barrel toward the porch. He was crying. "Drop it, son," Elias yelled over the roar in his ears. The kid didn't drop it. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The bullet went wide and hit the chimney stones, but it was enough. The choice had been made. Elias didn't hesitate. He put a round into the dirt right between the kid's feet. The spray of pebbles hit the boy in the face, and he curled into a ball screaming. It was a mercy shot, a warning. But Silas wasn't interested in mercy. He had leveled his ivory-handled pistol again. He wasn't aiming at Elias anymore. He was aiming at the floorboards of the porch, right where the crawl space was. He knows, Elias thought. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Silas didn't want the ledger. He wanted to hurt Elias the same way he had been hurt by the loss of the company's secrets. He wanted to take the one thing Elias had left. Elias stood up. He didn't take cover. He stepped right to the edge of the porch and opened fire. He emptied the Winchester in a steady rhythmic cadence. Bang, bang, bang. The lead chewed up the dirt around Silas's horse. It ripped through the man's coat. It sent the riders scrambling for the treeline. The yard went silent again, except for the sound of the kid's sobbing and the heavy breathing of the downed horse. The smoke hung low in the cold morning air. Silas was gone. He had vanished into the pines, but his voice drifted back through the trees like a ghost. "This isn't Abilene, Elias," Silas screamed. "I don't need a church to burn you out. I just need to wait for the wind to pick up." Elias stood on the porch and looked at his hands. They were steady, but the Winchester was empty. He looked down at the dirt where the locket was buried. A bullet had hit the ground right on top of it and turned the earth into a scar. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel like a man defending his home. He felt like the monster Silas had called him. And the worst part was that he was just getting started. He turned back toward the cabin door. He had to check on the girl. But he knew that the next time Silas came, he wouldn't be holding a torch. He would be bringing the fire. The wind began to shift just as the sun climbed behind the heavy gray clouds. It wasn't a strong wind, but it was steady. It blew from the treeline directly toward the porch. It carried the smell of pine needles and damp earth, but under that was something sharper, something chemical, the smell of coal oil. Elias stood on the edge of the porch and felt the hair on his arms stand up. He knew that smell. It was the scent of the beginning of the end. Silas wasn't going to try another head-on rush. He was done playing soldier. He was going back to being a burner. Elias stepped back into the cabin and pulled the heavy door shut. He dropped the oak bar into place with a thud that felt like a coffin lid closing. The room was dark except for the thin slats of light coming through the boarded-up windows. He walked over to the rug and knelt down. He tapped 3 times. Fast, like a woodpecker. A second later, the board lifted an inch. Clara's eyes were visible in the gap. They were wide and dark, but she wasn't crying. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "No," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "But they aren't coming inside yet. I need you to stay down there, Clara. No matter what you hear. No matter how hot it gets. You stay near the back wall where the stone foundation is. Do you hear me?" The girl nodded, and the board lowered back into place. Elias stood up and felt a surge of protective rage that almost made him dizzy. He looked at the room he had spent 3 years building. The table he had planed by hand. The chairs. The hearth. It was all just fuel now. Everything he had worked for was nothing more than kindling in the eyes of the company. He went to the water barrel in the corner. He began to soak every blanket he owned. He draped the heavy wet wool over the inside of the door and the window frames. It was an old trick he'd learned in the territories. It wouldn't stop a fire, but it might buy him an extra 10 minutes of breath. As he worked, he kept thinking about the silver locket buried in the yard. He wondered if Silas knew it was there. He wondered if the woman in the portrait was watching them from whatever place ghosts go when their churches are burnt down. Elias, he heard a voice call out from the yard. It was Silas. He sounded close. Too close. "I know you can hear me," Elias, Silas yelled. "The wind is picking up. It's a dry wind. The kind that likes to eat. You have 5 minutes to throw that ledger out the door. If I see the book, I'll let you," and the girl walked to the trailing. "You have my word." Elias leaned his forehead against the damp wool of the door. "Your word was worth a lot in Abilene, Silas," he said to the empty room. "It was worth exactly 32 lives." He didn't yell it back. He didn't want Silas to know where he was standing. He moved to the side of the cabin where the lean-to was. He could hear a rhythmic splashing sound. Slosh, slosh, slosh. The big man with the chain was back. He wasn't using the iron now. He was carrying buckets. He was dousing the side of the house in oil. Elias could hear the liquid soaking into the dry cedar logs. It was a soft sound like rain, but it was the deadliest sound he had ever heard. He raised the Winchester and aimed at the wall. He knew the big man was right on the other side. He could hear his heavy breathing. He could hear the clink of a bucket handle. All Elias had to do was pull the trigger, and the heavy lead would punch through the logs like they were paper. But he hesitated. If he fired now, Silas would drop the match instantly. The house would go up in seconds. He needed the big man to finish his work and move back. He needed Silas to think he was paralyzed by fear. Elias moved to the hearth. He reached for the loose stone and pulled the ledger out. He looked at the leather cover. This book was the reason Sarah was dead. It was the reason he was a monster. He felt a sudden, intense loathing for the object. It was just paper and ink, but it held more power than 1,000 rifles. He walked to the window and moved the heavy wet blanket just an inch. He could see Silas standing by the gate. He was holding a fresh torch. He wasn't lighting it yet. He was waiting for the big man to finish. The nervous kid was nowhere to be seen. Elias hoped the boy had kept writing. He hoped someone in this mess had the sense to get away. Suddenly, the splashing stopped. The big man's heavy footsteps moved away from the house. Elias, he heard Silas call out again. "Time's up. The ledger or the girl? Which one do you want to keep?" Elias didn't answer. He took the ledger and shoved it into the waistband of his trousers. He picked up both revolvers. He wasn't going to wait for the fire to come to him. He looked at the rug on the floor. 3 knocks, he whispered to himself. He moved to the back door, the one that led to the small garden and the steep drop-off into the creek bed. It was the only way out that Silas wasn't watching directly. He felt the first puff of heat through the logs. It was a soft golden glow that began to seep through the cracks in the south wall. The big man must have used a flint or a match. The sound was low at first, a soft crackle like someone walking on dry leaves. But within seconds it turned into a roar. The coal oil took hold, and the side of the cabin became a wall of screaming orange light. Elias felt the oxygen leave the room. The smoke began to curl through the ceiling. It was thick and black and smelled of ancient sins. He kicked the back door open. The heat hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't stop. He rolled out onto the dirt and stayed low. The smoke was his only cover now. He could hear Silas laughing from the front of the house. "Go ahead and stay in there," Elias, Silas screamed. See if the book burns as bright as the church did. Elias didn't look back at the flames. He crawled toward the woodpile near the creek. He needed to get behind Silas. He needed to be the ghost they thought he was. As he reached the shadows of the woodpile, he looked up and saw a figure standing in the smoke. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't the big man. It was the nervous kid. He was holding the silver locket in his hand. He had dug it up. He looked at Elias through the haze of the fire. His eyes were wide with a terrifying realization. "You," he whispered. Elias didn't say a word. He raised the revolver and pointed it at the boy's heart. The wind picked up. The cabin groaned as the fire climbed the roof. And in the distance the birds stopped singing. The roar of the fire was a living thing now. It sounded like 1,000 heavy wings beating against the logs of the cabin. The heat was a physical wall that pushed Elias back toward the woodpile. Smoke hung in thick, greasy curtains that tasted of coal, oil, and old cedar. Through the haze, Elias looked at the boy. The nervous kid wasn't shaking anymore. He was frozen. He stood there with the silver locket clutched in his hand, and the flickering light of the burning house reflected in his eyes. Elias kept the revolver leveled at the center of the boy's chest. His finger was light on the trigger, but his mind was a storm. He looked at the locket. He looked at the boy's face. "Why did you dig it up?" Elias asked. His voice was a rasp that barely carried over the sound of the flames. The kid didn't look at the gun. He looked at the smoke rising from the roof where Clara was hidden. "I saw you bury it," he whispered. His voice was cracked and thin. "I thought it was the ledger. I thought if I found it first, Silas would let me go. But it's not a book of names. It's her." The boy held the locket out as if it were a holy relic. "Silas told us you were a butcher, Elias. He told us you stood by and laughed while the church in Abilene turned to ash. He told us you kept the gold and let the people scream. But a man who laughs at fires doesn't bury a portrait of a woman in the dirt like a prayer." Elias felt a sharp coldness in his gut. The boy was seeing a truth that Silas had spent 7 years trying to erase. Silas didn't want the ledger because of the names. He wanted it because it was the only thing that proved Silas was the one who chained the doors. Elias was just the man who didn't have the courage to break them. Elias took a step forward. The heat from the cabin was blistering the paint on the woodpile behind him. "Give it to me, son." The kid didn't move. He looked at the burning cabin and then back at Elias. "There's someone in there, isn't there? I saw you looking at the floorboards through the window before the oil started flying." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. The oxygen was being sucked out of the yard by the growing fire. He could hear the heavy oak beams of the roof beginning to groan. If the roof collapsed, the crawl space would become a tomb. He didn't have time to argue with a boy who was having a crisis of conscience. "I'm not going to tell you again," Elias said. "Drop the locket and get to the creek. If Silas sees you talking to me, he'll put a bullet in your back before you can blink." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a shadow emerged from the front of the house. It was Silas. He was covered in soot, and his eyes were bloodshot from the smoke. He was holding his ivory-handled revolver, and he looked like a man who had finally lost his grip on reality. "Well, now," Silas called out. His voice was jagged and high. "It looks like the student and the master are having a heart-to-heart. Did he tell you about the fire, kid? Did he tell you how the air smells when 100 years of history goes up in smoke?" Silas stopped 10 feet away. He didn't look at the burning house. He didn't look at the big man with the chain who was currently trying to lead the spooked horses away from the heat. He only had eyes for Elias. "I see you have your iron out, Elias," Silas said. He gestured with his chin toward the revolver in Elias's hand. "Are you going to shoot a boy for holding a piece of jewelry? Or are you going to show him the ledger?" The kid looked at Silas and then at the locket. He looked like he was seeing Silas for the first time. "You lied to me," he said. His voice was stronger now. "You said he was the one who did it. But you're the one who brought the oil today. You're the one who's laughing." Silas's face contorted. "Shut up, boy. You don't know the first thing about Abilene. You weren't there when the company gave the order. You didn't have to choose between a life of luxury and a life of running." Silas turned his gaze back to Elias. "You think you're better than me because you kept the book. But you're just as guilty. You watched her die, Elias. You stood there with the ledger in your arms, and you let the fire take her." Elias felt the words hit him like lead. It was the truth he had been running from for 7 years. He hadn't lit the match, but he had been the one with the power to stop it, and he had chosen the paper instead of the person. He looked at the burning cabin. He could almost hear the ghosts of Abilene screaming in the roar of the cedar logs. He looked at the rug on the floor inside the house through the open back door. The fire hadn't reached the back wall yet, but the smoke was a black wall. Clara was down there. I'm not the man I was, Silas, Elias said. And this isn't Abilene. Elias didn't fire at Silas. He turned and ran toward the burning cabin. What are you doing? Silas screamed. You'll burn alive, you fool. Elias didn't stop. He dove through the back door into the blackness. The heat was so intense it felt like his skin was being peeled off. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't breathe. He dropped to his knees and crawled toward the spot where the rug had been. The rug was already on fire. He threw it aside with his bare hands and felt the skin on his palms blister instantly. He didn't feel the pain. He only felt the wood. He found the board. He hammered his fist against it. 1, 2, 3. The board didn't move. Elias screamed her name, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the roof collapsing in the front room. The heat was turning the air into poison. He grabbed the edge of the board with his bleeding fingers and pulled with everything he had. The board gave way. Clara was there curled into a ball. She was pale and her eyes were squeezed shut, but she was alive. He reached down and scooped her up into his arms. She was so small, so light. He turned back toward the door, but the way was blocked. A heavy beam had fallen across the exit, and the oil-soaked logs were a wall of solid flame. He was trapped. He sat back against the stone chimney and pulled Clara close to his chest. He covered her face with his wet wool vest. He looked up at the ceiling and saw the fire dancing in the rafters. Outside, he heard a single gunshot, then another. He didn't know who was shooting. He didn't know if the kid was dead or if Silas was coming for the ledger. He just held the girl and closed his eyes. I've got you, he whispered. I've got you. He felt the heat closing in, and for a moment, he wasn't in the mountains anymore. He was back in Abilene. He was standing by the horses. But this time, he wasn't holding the ledger. He was holding the girl. And for the first time in 7 years, the screaming in his head stopped. The air inside the cabin was no longer air. It was a thick soup of gray soot and searing heat that clawed at Elias's throat with every breath. He stayed flat against the stone foundation of the chimney, holding Clara so tight he could feel the frantic drumming of her heart against his ribs. Above them, the ceiling was a map of glowing red veins as the fire ate through the heavy cedar rafters. A shower of sparks rained down, and Elias shielded the girl with his own body, feeling the stabs of heat as the embers burnt holes in his wool vest. He knew they only had minutes. The stone chimney was the only thing keeping the roof from flattening them, but the mortar was beginning to crack from the extreme temperature. He looked toward the back door. The fallen beam was a wall of solid orange flame, but through the gaps in the fire, he saw a flicker of movement in the yard. Outside, the world had turned into a nightmare of smoke and shadows. Silas stood by the gate, his face illuminated by the inferno of the house he had built and then destroyed. He was screaming, but the roar of the fire swallowed his words. He looked like a man who had finally found the hell he had been searching for since Abilene. To his left, the nervous kid was standing over the body of the big man's horse. The boy was holding his revolver with both hands, and his face was streaked with tears and soot. He wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at Silas. He was looking at the man who had turned a beautiful mountain morning into a slaughterhouse. The big man with the chain was struggling to his feet near the treeline. He was clutching his shoulder where he had hit the ground, but he was still a mountain of a man. He saw the kid pointing the gun at Silas, and he began to move. He didn't have his chain now. He had a heavy Bowie knife that glinted in the firelight. Silas didn't see the big man. He only saw the fire. He was convinced Elias was burning. He was convinced the ledger was turning to ash and taking all his sins with it. He started to laugh, a high, thin sound that cut through the roar of the flames like a knife. It's over, Elias, Silas screamed. I told you I'd bring the fire. I told you the company always gets its due. The kid took a step toward Silas. Drop the gun, Silas, the boy yelled. His voice was shaking, but the barrel of the revolver was steady. You lied about everything. You lied about the church. You lied about the girl. Silas turned slowly. He looked at the boy as if he were an insect that had just learned to speak. You think you're a hero now, kid. You're just a witness. And we both know what happens to witnesses in this territory. Silas raised his ivory-handled pistol. He didn't hesitate. He was a professional killer, and the boy was just a boy. But Silas forgot one thing. He forgot about the big man. The giant with the knife didn't care about the ledger. He didn't care about Abilene. He cared about the horse Elias had shot. He cared about the pain in his shoulder. And he saw Silas as the reason for all of it. If Silas hadn't brought them here, the horse would be alive. The big man didn't want a witness. He wanted a sacrifice. Before Silas could pull the trigger on the boy, the big man reached him. He didn't use the knife. He used his massive soot-stained hands. He grabbed Silas by the throat and lifted him off the ground. The ivory-handled pistol went off, but the shot went wild into the air. Silas kicked and clawed at the big man's face, but it was like a rabbit fighting a bear. The big man didn't say a word. He just walked toward the burning porch. Inside the cabin, Elias heard the heavy thud of boots on the wood. He saw the shadow of the two men through the wall of flame at the door. He didn't wait to see what happened next. He saw an opening. The fallen beam had shifted as the floorboards buckled. There was a gap no wider than a man's shoulders leading toward the back garden. He grabbed the heavy water bucket he had used to soak the blankets. It was half empty, but it was enough. He dumped the remaining water over himself and Clara. The sudden cold was a shock that made him gasp. Now Elias whispered. He stood up and dove through the gap. The flames licked at his clothes, and he felt the hair on the back of his neck singe, but he didn't stop. He rolled into the dirt of the garden and kept moving. He didn't look back until he reached the edge of the creek bed. He collapsed into the tall, damp grass and pulled Clara into his lap. He checked her over with frantic hands. She was coughing and her face was black with soot, but she was breathing. She looked at the house and then at him. "The monster is gone," she whispered. Elias looked back at the cabin. The entire roof was collapsing now. A massive pillar of sparks shot hundreds of feet into the black morning sky. In the center of the fire, he saw two silhouettes locked together on the porch. Then the floor gave way and the shadows disappeared into the white-hot center of the ruin. Silas was gone. The big man was gone. The debt of Abilene had finally been paid in full. Elias looked toward the gate. The nervous kid was sitting in the dirt with his head in his hands. He had dropped the revolver. He looked like a broken toy. Elias stood up. His legs felt like they were made of water, and his hands were a mess of blisters and blood, but he felt a strange lightness in his chest. He reached into his waistband and pulled out the ledger. The leather was scorched. The edges of the pages were black, but the names inside were still legible. The secrets were still there. He walked toward the kid. The boy didn't look up until Elias was standing right over him. Elias didn't say anything. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket he had snatched from the dirt before he dove into the house. He handed the silver oval to the boy. "You take this," Elias said. His voice was almost gone. "You take this, and you ride until you find a town that doesn't have a name on a map. You find a life that doesn't involve carrying a gun for men like Silas." The boy looked at the locket and then at Elias. "What about you?" Elias looked at the smoking ruins of his home. He looked at Clara, who was standing by the creek watching the water. "I'm going to finish my work," Elias said. He turned away from the boy and walked back toward the fire. He didn't go to the house. He went to the hearth. The chimney was still standing like a lonely sentinel in the ash. He reached into the hole he had carved in the stone and pulled out the small tin box he had hidden there long ago. Inside wasn't money. It was a single dried flower and a letter that had never been sent. He sat down in the dirt and watched the embers glow. The sun was fully up now, but the valley was silent. The horses were gone. The riders were gone. He looked at the ledger in his lap. He thought about the judges, the marshals, the men who thought they were safe because they were powerful. He stood up and tossed the book into the hottest part of the fire. The paper curled. The ink blurred. The names of 100 sinners turned into a soft white ash that the wind caught and carried away over the peaks. He didn't need the book to be a monster, and he didn't need the book to be a man. He walked back to Clara and took her hand. "Let's go," he said. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the ridge," Elias said. "There's a stand of cedar up there that's so thick you can walk through it at noon and believe it's dusk. It's a good place to start over." They walked into the trees and didn't look back. The mountain did what mountains do. It kept. It endured. And it waited for the snow to come and wash the ash away. The walk to the high ridge was slow and silent. Elias didn't carry much. He had the girl. He had the tin box. And he had the long shadow of a life he had finally stopped trying to outrun. They climbed until the smell of the burning cedar was a faint memory on the wind, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the dry pine needles. When they reached the stand of timber Elias had mentioned, he stopped. He sat Clara down on a fallen log and looked back at the valley. From this height, the cabin was just a black scar on the green floor of the mountain. The smoke was still rising, but it was thin now, like a gray finger pointing at the sky. Elias looked at his hands. The blisters were starting to weep, and the soot was etched into the lines of his palms like ink. He was 60 miles from the nearest lawman and 300 miles from the men who ran the company. He was a man with no home and no history. He opened the tin box. He pulled out the dried flower first. It was a prairie lily, brittle and colorless. He remembered the day Sarah had given it to him. It was a week before the fire. They had been sitting by the creek in Abilene, and she had talked about moving west. She had talked about a place where the air didn't taste like coal dust, and the people didn't look at Elias like he was a hired gun. She had seen the man he could be before he ever saw it himself. He looked at the letter. It was the one he had written to her while he was sitting in the saddle outside the church. He had meant to hand it to her after the meeting was over. He had meant to tell her that he was done with Silas, that he was done with the company, that they were leaving that night. But the match had been struck before he could reach the door. He had kept the letter for 7 years as a penance. He had kept it to remind himself of the man who was too slow to be a hero and too quiet to be a saint. He looked at the girl. Clara was watching him with those dark, steady eyes. She didn't ask about the letter. She didn't ask about the woman in the locket. She just waited for him to decide who they were going to be now. Elias took the letter and the flower, and he buried them in the soft earth beneath the oldest cedar tree on the ridge. He didn't need the paper anymore. The debt Silas spoke of wasn't about money or ledgers. It was about the weight of things unsaid. And by choosing the girl over the book in the fire, he had finally found the words. He stood up and looked at the horizon. The mountains stretched out forever, a jagged sea of blue and gray. Somewhere out there, the nervous kid was riding toward a new life. Somewhere out there, the company was waiting for a ledger that would never arrive. He looked at Clara. "You're going to need a new name," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to blend into the wind. "In this valley, you aren't a beau and you aren't a ghost. You're a croft, and a croft doesn't look back at fires." The girl stood up and took his hand. Her grip was small, but it was firm. "Are we going to build another house?" she asked. Elias looked at the thick stand of cedar. The trees were tall and straight. The wood was good. The water was close. He looked at his hands and saw the strength that was still there beneath the burns and the soot. "We're going to build something better than a house, Clara. We're going to build a life that doesn't need a ledger to prove it exists." He turned away from the valley and led her deeper into the shadows of the timber. The mountain did what mountains do. It kept the secrets of the men who bled on its slopes. It held the ash of the fires and the echoes of the gunshots. And it waited for the snow to come and cover the tracks of the man who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. Elias Croft was a monster once. He was a burner and a hunter and a man who stood by while the world went up in flames. But as he disappeared into the high country, he wasn't thinking about the fire. He was thinking about the boots he would have to make for the girl. He was thinking about the winter wood he would have to cut. He was thinking about being the right man for the first time in his life. The sun hit the ridge, and for a moment the valley was filled with a golden light that made the ruins of the cabin look like a temple. Then the wind shifted. The smoke vanished, and the mountain was silent once again.